I forgot to put my name up here. I'm John Woodward, Dr. Woodward. I know some of you in here already because you've been either in a class or near me at some point. Someone who was a wonderful person nominated me, apparently, to give my last lecture. And I was unclear as to whether this was supposed to be the last lecture before I died or the last lecture before I left the college. I'm not leaving the college, and I'm not dying. Well, not that I know of. I'm not sure, of course, but I don't believe I am. But no, this is a wonderful idea by Kerry Roth and his team to give students a last sort of push out of FSCJ's door to some extent and give them a chance to hear from someone they liked, apparently. So I'm happy that someone liked me. This is also very good. And of all the honors that I've had at this institution, not that many, but I've had some, I think this is definitely the highest honor I have ever been granted. So I'm happy that you want to be here to listen to me, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit about something that has obsessed me since I was probably 6 years old. And that is not aesthetics per se, these two for sure, and art in place of aesthetics. But I want to talk a little bit about what this means and get into some of this. I also intentionally tried to choose a very pretentious title, since maybe if you are leaving FSCJ, you're going on to a bachelor's program, and they get a little bit more pretentious in bachelor's programs, the second 2 years. And then if you go on to master's degree and PhD, it's nothing but pretentiousness, and that's what's so great about it. That's why we love it. We get to be that way. So, a little bit of a pretentious title. And potentially a little bit old-fashioned, but I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Do any of you know what this word means, aesthetics? Aha! So we're also learning some terminology here. You all know what this word means, knowledge, right? Okay. Truth, you don't know what that means because no one really does. That's the catch. Anyway, let's start looking at something. Now, in my area, which I first started as an English major, I wanted to be a linguist, and then I wanted to be a medievalist, which also involves historical linguistics, and then I was told I would never get a job. So, that happens to everybody in college at some point. But this was a professor of Old English who said, no, you don't want to do Old English. People have to die before you could get a job in Old English. So I moved on from there and finished my English degree, got a German degree. So I stuck with languages. Languages are particularly fascinating and important to me. We communicate with language, and many of us, I think, in this room probably know more than one language. I certainly know more than one language, and I think many of our students are automatically bilingual when they come here. So some of this is something that you intuit, and we'll talk about intuitions in a moment, something you intuit, but don't necessarily think that much about potentially. What you may not know is that this used to be a word, potentially, maybe, a whole long time ago. This is what's known as Proto-Indo-European, and this is not a lecture on linguistics, so I'm not going to go much further than that, other than to say that Proto-Indo-European is a reconstructed language. No one has ever known anyone who spoke this. That is the root of all of the European languages, excluding Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and Basque. Now, those don't fit into Indo-European. And Sanskrit in India. Iranian is part of this branch as well, the Iranian language. So this particular language goes back to a root civilization or culture or something that then spread out and took their language with them into other places. And so what's fascinating about the word aesthetic is that it goes back to a Greek word. That's the Greek word, not written in Greek because I can't read Greek letters, and I don't speak Greek, but that's the word in Greek. And from there, you find a word, aestheio or something, which is the root for this word. You'll find variations of this in Latin and some other Indo-European languages as well. So what does the word originally mean? The word originally means perception. So oftentimes we use the word that's aesthetically pleasing or aesthetics or something like that to mean something is pretty. Well, we'll talk about a man by the name of Immanuel Kant in a minute. That's not really what the word means. The word comes into the English language bearing some of that meaning because we borrowed it from German. But in German and in some scholars in English, it means the process of perceiving something. It's about perceiving something and thinking about what it is that you are perceiving. That's what the aesthetic is all about, and that's what we're going to talk more about. If anybody has been in my sexuality class where we've read a lovely man by the name of Ovid, who drives some people crazy because he's not a very nice person. He has this wonderful little quote, does anyone think that art rates a dowry? And a dowry is a payment. You can think of it as a payment to get into a marriage. And he's lamenting the fact that the Roman culture is losing its values, it's losing its art and its love of art, and artists are not paid, and there's some other things in there. But what that brings up, it's a lovely quote to talk about how art, in its process of being an aesthetic thing, is also something that's generated or is related to class. That we think of art as being a high-class thing. We think of art as being something that we will never own because we don't have $220 million to go buy a Van Gogh. I'd love to have a Van Gogh, but I'm not going to pay that. I would rather pay that to buy 220 million would buy me 220 plus Lamborghinis. I'd rather have 220 Lamborghinis. Those are works of art from my point of view. But, you know, I can go to a museum and see a Van Gogh and pay a lot less than $220 million for it. It is a classed concept. Wealth generates and is related to art. And that is a part of modernity, and it is a part of capitalism, and it is a part of the process of art being related to nobility and noble concepts that we may talk a little bit about. Another important thing is to talk about how value is a fiction, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Well, it's fine. I need to not touch. I'm not used to being able to not touch something. This one, art versus entertainment, is another one of my, being someone who has a PhD in the humanities studying film, that is a bit of an issue. That is a discussion. It's a long-standing discussion. Why can't I just enjoy a movie? Because you're in my class, you can't. I'm not going to show you movies that are enjoyable. It's just the way it is. You have to suffer. Art is about the struggle. It's the suffering. But I want to talk a little bit more about that. There's an important moment that happens at the beginning of the 20th century. Actually, I think it's important in the philosophy of a man by the name of John Dewey. And some of you know who John Dewey was because, you know, he's related to where we are. An important person. He was also a philosopher. And his point of view is that art and the aesthetic has to do with our own personal experiences and how we interact with the world on a day-to-day basis. And I want to talk a little bit about language, social reality, art slipping past the norms of experience. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And this last one is another thing that inspired this particular thought to what I wanted to do in this lecture. With this notion of aesthetics and how it links to politics. And if you may have read someone by the name of Walter Benjamin. If you were in my film class, you would have pretended as though you read it. I don't think I see anybody from my film class. It's a bit difficult. But what he did point out is that those Nazis look pretty. They dress really awesome uniforms. There's an attractiveness to that. There's an attractiveness to that sense not of being of a community, that may be part of it, but just the simple visual pleasure of looking at all of that design that they have that may be problematic. So, and then this last statement may be a bit controversial. Paul Hendrickson is not here, so I can say it. Paul's our resident philosopher, and he and I would probably have to have a long conversation about this. But from my point of view, politics is the language of truth in our contemporary world, and I hope to be able to get to that in just a moment. But first, I want us to think a little bit about being children or having children. Some of my fondest memories as a child, I know this is going to sound a little strange, but is of having a piece of paper and a pencil and just drawing random things hour after hour. They were horrible. They were not worth preserving in any way. They had no aesthetic values whatsoever, but there was a pleasure associated with it. I wanted to sit there and represent. I wanted to sit there and create little characters, and mostly it was dive bombers, bombing cities and stuff. I did that a lot. But I wanted to recreate the world that was around me, or an imagined world. And so I like to think that, and I say this in some of my classes, I think that it's pretty clear to me that one of the things that clearly separates us off from other mammalian species, including close relatives, is the fact that we attempt to represent the world around us. Other animals use tools. Other animals create beautiful things. The bowerbird. Does anybody know anything about the bowerbird? The male bird will create this incredibly complicated little bower so that the female bird will fly by, take a look at it, and see if she likes it, and then fly off if she doesn't. And these things take days and days and days to build. They weave the twigs together like a bird would with a nest, but they also put colors in them. So specific bowerbirds will choose blue, and there'll be blue things all over their little bower. It will be absolutely beautiful when they're done with it. And then after the two little birds do what it is that they do, they leave it. It's done. It just collapses, falls apart. It's not preserved in any way. So for whatever reason, this animal creates what I would think of as being beautiful things, lovely things. But it doesn't try to represent itself. It doesn't create another version of it, its mother, its family members. Like we sit and draw the little stick man. Bowerbirds don't do this. Monkeys don't do this. Elephants don't do this. They don't try to recreate themselves in the world. That seems to be something that human beings do. It also seems to be, this is my daughter's, by the way, just to highlight my daughter's genius here with her little, she was 8, I think, at the point, and she created this little stick man, super stick man, and then of course at the end there was super stick woman. But she never finished the comic strip, so I don't know what happened with super stick woman. But at any rate, this desire to craft little human beings and put them into the world and reproduce our own humanity or our own narratives and stuff like that, that seems to be something that is, at this point, fairly unique to us as human beings. It also seems to be something that's an evolved component of being a human being. We have evolved to have this for some reason. Now, that doesn't mean that, if you know anything about evolution, that's not to say that it has a specific purpose. Evolution doesn't evolve things for a specific purpose necessarily, but it's there. It wasn't eradicated at some point. We may have found value in it at some point, and it certainly, I think we find value in it now. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I want to say. Imagination is another important component I'll talk about in just a moment, because I also want to show this. Outside of our children drawing, our ancestors drew or tried to capture, you know about cave paintings, I'm sure. So there they are painting the animals of the world around them, but not many representations of human beings. This one seems to be a clear attempt at representing a human-animal hybrid. This is, oh, the date didn't come through. This is from, I guess I didn't click save. I hope everything's on here. This is from 35,000 BC, 40,000 BC. That's roughly when it was made. So well into the reign of Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens by that point had only really just moved into Europe where this was found. A standing lion suggests that it's an attempt to create a human being, a human form with a little lion head. That's not universally believed. There's lots of different interpretations of what this means. So maybe it's a bit early for a human. But for this one, and this is in Lascaux, the Lascaux Caves, in France. A number of these caves are in France. This one is definitely, seemingly, a human being. Hands, feet, you can see the feet. That's just like my kids draw feet. And it's just like my kids draw hands, too. The bird's beautiful. But, so this is oftentimes called the Birdman because it looks like he has a beak or a sort of a long head. Be that as it may, this could be, the way I like to look at this is that this bison here has been gored. You can see his intestines falling out. And that doesn't kill a bison. Bisons will go on a long time after they have been mortally wounded. And what they're going to try to do is to kill the people who are mortally wounding it, as many people know. And so it seems as though this may be a representation of a victim of the bison. So maybe there's an aspect of memorialization or remembering. Maybe it's a word of warning. Hey kids, gather around and hear the story of Joe. Don't be like Joe. Don't stand in front of the pointy end of the bison. Bad idea. Or maybe it's a spiritualist thing, magical. That's also a leading argument or understanding what the Lascaux Caves are, related to magical thinking and trying to help human beings manage these animals. But whatever it is human beings representing other human beings. So now we get to Immanuel Kant, and for some reason I didn't write his first name. I assumed all of you know who Immanuel Kant is. My apologies. Immanuel Kant, 18th century German philosopher, latter part of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and very important for a lot of modern turns in philosophy. Many people would say that contemporary philosophy really goes back to Kant. He's a very important component of it. And I want to talk about something that it segues a little bit of what we saw, but also plays into it. What Kant does he writes about aesthetics in the 18th century, and he is trying to come up with an understanding about this notion of perception and specifically the judgment that goes along with perception. We don't just perceive things, we also judge them, we think about them. We're not generally speaking passive receivers of information or visual arts or whatever it is. We think about what it is that we are perceiving. And what he calls this is an aesthetic judgment. We judge what it is that we are seeing. And from his point of view, for a true aesthetic judgment, there are 4 features. The first is disinterestedness. That means that, and I don't have it written up here. Let me see if I have it on another slide. No, okay. That means that pleasure, the pleasure that you get from looking at an image, does not precede your judging it aesthetically, or that you at least can pull them apart. That they are, for Kant, they are separate things. And here we get into the notion of entertainment. He doesn't say there's anything wrong with entertainment, but that entertainment is a pleasurable experience. You feel good. But that, for Kant, has nothing to do with whether it's an aesthetic experience, whether you think and judge it outside of whether it gives you pleasure or not, as being valuable. That's an important component. The way I like to think about this is, not all of you are as old as I am, but my childhood goes well into the 80s, I'll just put it that way. And I will hear songs that I used to absolutely adore when I was back in those 80s, and now I am totally embarrassed by ever having anything to do with ever liking anything about that particular song. I will deny it to my dying day. I never liked that song. What are you talking about? That's a horrible song. Why? Because at the time it gave me pleasure, but now I recognize there is literally no aesthetic value in that song, that one-hit wonder or whatever it was. It can still give me pleasure, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that it has any sort of aesthetic value about it. And so those two things are separate. And you can do your own experiments for all the songs that you hate, too. And you may find something doesn't create feeling in you, but still be able to think about it as an aesthetic object. So that's an important component for Kant. The second two are universal and necessary, and these are blended together a little bit, but effectively the idea is that a reasonable human being would think that other reasonable human beings would agree with her about the aesthetic value of that work. They may not agree with the quantity of the aesthetic value. They may not agree that it's as important as some other work, but they will agree that it has some sort of aesthetic value. That's a component of an aesthetic judgment. That speaks to community, which I want to come back to in a moment as well. And then this last one, which is also very important, is to appear purposive without purpose. To think of an aesthetic object as though it feels as though it's got a purpose, but it doesn't have a purpose. It's paint on canvas. It's marble and gets in my way. It doesn't have an actual purpose. It doesn't hold up a building. But it feels as though it's got some sort of purpose. That, he also says, is important for that aesthetic judgment. That's the one I was talking about. Should precede pleasure rather than vice versa. Precede, as I said, or be separate from. And then that's that other one. Should be, judgment should be shared. You should assume, there should be an inbuilt assumption that other reasonable people will share your judgment about that object. That's where I'm going for. And that's the other problem that I have there, the socially determined issues, cultural norms and things like that, which is where we get in modern aesthetics as critiques about aesthetics, that objects are culturally normed. Beauty is culturally normed. A beautiful human being is culturally normed. A beautiful human being is culturally normed. You may not think that that's true, right? Everybody thinks Brad Pitt's like attractive, even if you're not somebody doesn't think Brad Pitt's attractive. Okay.
Like Danny DeVito. Okay.
Danny DeVito. Everybody thinks Danny DeVito is attractive. Well, when we think of, I'll give you a quick little experiment here to prove that I'm right about these cultural norms. When we think that beauty, which gender is beautiful, men or women? Just react to that. Is a woman beautiful or is a man beautiful? Women are beautiful. That's the kind of association we make. Women, beauty. Man, we don't say beautiful necessarily, right? We have other words. We have handsome, things like that. But handsome doesn't mean beautiful, right? It means there are a whole bunch of other things that go along with handsome, including hand and meaning usefulness, right? So let's say 8th century, 7th century, pre-4th century, that would have been totally the opposite. Women were not beautiful. They could be attractive. It's not a problem. You could be sexually attracted to them. That's okay. But not beauty. Beauty was only, and a number of you know this already because I've talked about this in my sexuality class, beauty was only the male body. The male body was beautiful because it was perfect. It was finished. It could achieve perfection. Women, that was completely impossible. So there was no way to talk about them as being beautiful. So that flip, I know it's horrible to think like this. This is the way it was for the Greeks and Romans at any rate. Persians were a bit different on this, by the way. The Egyptians were totally different about all of this. But that flip happens in Europe in the 15th century. And there's a moment there where early Renaissance artists like Donatello and Michelangelo are crafting beautiful male bodies in the nude, in their perfection. And then it shifts to we have beautiful female bodies in the nude. And that becomes the beautiful norm, the lounging woman's body in the nude, about to get dressed, generally speaking. So that means that cultural norms shift. Some understanding of beauty shift, and it crafts to some extent, our innate concepts of attraction get crafted through those filters of beautiful, useful, etc. I also want to talk a little bit about someone that I'm sure no one knows about, and that's Benedetto Croce. He's not necessarily the most important aesthetician, but he does something that's pretty important from my point of view, and that is that he talks about art, aesthetics, as being a type of knowledge and being related to knowledge, how we know the world, how we interact with the world. That aesthetics is a part of that, and it's a very important moment because I think we intuit that that's true. Now I have some lovely things here. This is a work by Van Gogh, as I have up there, 1887. What are these? Can you see what they are? Boots, right. Can you put these on? No, they're paint. You can't put them on. Yeah. You can't actually put these on your feet. You cannot use them. You can't walk around with them. They don't have a purpose. Now, outside of the fact that they are paint, they're also sort of discarded. And so maybe their purpose has been used. There's a wide way of thinking about purpose, but they fundamentally do not have a purpose. Their purpose in the canvas is for us to look at them. They don't have a purpose out of it. That's that purpose without a purpose concept in Kant. And then there's a parallel. Any of you who've read Jameson's work on postmodernity, you'll recognize the two works that we're looking at. Walker Evans was one of the many photographers, quite a brilliant photographer, who were sent around the United States by the government to photograph the trials and tribulations of the poor during the economic downturn, as we call them now, also known as a depression, during that period. And his photographs are very striking, beautiful, and disturbing on occasion. And I don't know that he intentionally is using Van Gogh's work as a sort of a comparator here, but certainly you see a lot of similarities. But you have the same idea that these don't have a purpose because it's a photograph. I can't put them on. The purpose of the representation is for me to look at it. But I look at it not thinking about that. I don't look at it and think the purpose of this is for me to look at it, because that will create a feedback loop. You wouldn't be able to remove yourself from it. Instead, we look at it and we see the shoes. We see them and we think about them as objects that have a purpose. But we know somewhere, from Kant's point of view, that they don't have a purpose, that they are a representation of that object. Now, one other thing I want to introduce here is that there's another wonderful philosophical point of view that gets talked about quite a bit in film studies. And this is a man by the name of Stanley Cavell. And he has a beautiful quote about cinema, film, and its relationship to other arts. And in that, he says that painting, in this situation, is the representation of a world, whereas photography is a representation of the world. So there's only one world here, whereas painting comes more, from his point of view, from the imagination. Should keep that in mind too. But let me move on. So, slipping the bounds of purpose is an aesthetic judgment, is an aesthetic component. Part of being an aesthetic object is to remove us from thinking exclusively about purpose. Move us away from thinking exclusively about outcome. Thinking exclusively, if we're talking about cinema, about the end of the movie, about who's going to win, who's going to lose, etc. That an aesthetic moment or an aesthetic judgment removes us from that. And we think instead about the object as an aesthetic object rather than having some sort of specific purpose. So one function of this is that it also reminds us, to some extent, it gives us a vehicle into thinking about another set of relationships. And that is the relationship between the really real world, as John Searle would say, and the social world. And he calls them really real reality, I think is the way he says it, but then also social reality. Both of these are real, but they're not quite the same. So in the really real world, things like boulders will kill us, right? Gravity will mean we will die, or we'll jump off the building, and all that kind of stuff. These are things that we can't change. We can't talk about them and make them change. We can't negotiate new meanings about them. Jumping off the roof will kill you. That's it. There is no other way to talk about this. There is an inevitability to it. That is the really real world. But quite a lot of what we do, most of what we do, is interact with each other in a socially real world, which for John Searle has a concrete reality about it as well. It's real. I can't change the fact just by not wanting to that it's expected that I walk around with clothes on. I can't change that fact. I can walk around without clothes on and end up in jail every single day and maybe struggle against it and use that as my struggle for being able to, I wouldn't want to, by the way, I'm not a nudist, but just to give you an idea, all of us make these decisions collectively somehow through law and through conventions. And there's no way for us to modify those or change them. And so an aesthetic object gives us an access point into that division where things are socially determined as just there, or things are leather and they have a certain feeling, and they come from a cow and stuff like that. But the boot is more than just a chunk of leather comes from a cow. It is also a symbol. It tells us something about the person who is wearing it, and that creates those social networks. But what's also important is that social reality is us determining. It's a community. It's us as a community that work through these things and determine these things. And these truths, which are as concrete as the truth about jumping off the building, just because they're modifiable doesn't mean that they are not equally somehow true, certainly to us. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily good either. Construction of social reality. I'm going to come back to that thought a little bit more later, because I have lovely paintings to show you. The ambassadors. You ever seen the ambassadors? You see the mess, like it looks like a Photoshop thing here at the bottom? A mistake, a Photoshop mistake is what I like to think of it. This is one of the great mystery paintings. It's not really clear who these two people are. There's a little bit of a controversy about it. So it may be a portrait, it may be intended to be a portrait, or it may be intended to be what's called sort of a genre painting, a word of warning painting. It's got typically generic things, globes signaling the exploration of the world, music signaling the arts. There's a math book down here by a famous mathematician who was right at the cusp. He was the last real scholar of the geocentric world before it shifted over into being the solar-centric world. And then you have the skull that's at the bottom. Now, if you stand right here, and I can come back to this later if you want to, the skull actually is properly proportioned. So when you walk past it, you see a skull. And then you walk around and the skull kind of gets all contorted and it's strange. And one of the ideas for this is that outside of the technical quality of it, which is astonishing, is that this is intended to be in something like a stairwell, and as you're walking down, you see the skull first, because you come past it, and you see the skull and you walk around, and then it stretches out. So there is no specific purpose here, but it just because it doesn't have a purpose doesn't mean that it doesn't have messages to give you. It isn't trying to tell you something, and Kant would not disagree with that. Purposelessness does not mean that it doesn't carry meaning or that it doesn't carry other sets of values with it that try to tell us things or try to warn us about things or etc., and that they are still aesthetic values. So Croce talks about those two types of knowledge. One is logical knowledge and one is aesthetic knowledge. And so that's how I link together aesthetics and knowledge. I'm going to get to truth eventually. Right now, linking together aesthetics and knowledge. And And these are just a number of quotes that we can look at. Knowledge has two forms, intuitive or logical. Knowledge obtained through the imagination is intuitive. So Croce is one of the ones who, as a young person who did recognize that my imagination or our imaginations create things, and they create things that are knowledge for us. We can imagine a lot about the world, and it can be accurate. This happens in science. You can imagine answers to questions in hypotheses, for example, and then prove that your imagined answer was correct. You imagined that answer. You used a part of your brain that put together this without data coming from the outside. This is a long-standing discourse in philosophy, so it's not as though this is over with. But what it seems quite clear is that if you talk about it as sort of an aesthetic concept, then we can imagine beings in the world. We can imagine the look of people we don't know. We can imagine full-formed human beings that we will never meet because they come straight out of our imagination. We can imagine heroes, etc. So it seems as though, that there's a type of knowledge that's associated with that. It seems pretty straightforward to me. That was not that important. This is associated with something called intuitions. And from Croce's point of view, every time we have an intuition, it is at the same time an expression, like a work of art is an expression. And so what he is doing is he is linking together aesthetic thought, the ability to speak, to express your ideas, the ability to draw your ideas, to craft an understanding directly to these aesthetic intuitions. And that if you are unable to create this expression, it doesn't mean, from Croce's point of view, that you are simply not skilled at it. It means that that intuition is simply not really there. Now, that's a bit of a stark thing. Effectively, he's saying, if you're unable to talk about something, then you don't have any ideas about it. If you're unable to express it, if you're unable to paint it, then you don't have any ideas about it. That there's an identical linkage between works of art and this powerful, for him, intuitive knowledge. So great works of art, not only, if we add this on, are approached from a disinterested point of view, and reasonable people will find that there's a connection that you'll be able to discuss on thinking about the Kant's notions, and that there's a purposelessness there. But if we add on this idea too, that there is works of art are communicating some powerful intuition that we ourselves do not have or had not had access to, then that gives us a better picture of what we're talking about when it comes to this aesthetic judgment. That not only is there that sense of disinterestedness, but there's also this powerful this powerful intuition that we did not have, that has been given to us. It has awakened something in us, potentially. That's a good and a bad. My favorite painting, so I had to put it here. One of my two favorite paintings, so I had to put it here. And there's also a lovely, lovely piece in Croce about the Alba Madonna, or one of his many Madonnas. I don't know if it's the Alba Madonna, but one of the many Madonnas. And what he's saying is that, look, some people will say, anybody could have painted this if they had had the skills that Raphael had, if they had learned the techniques that Raphael had learned. Anybody could have painted Raphael. And there are plenty of people who cheat, not plagiarists, I'm thinking about that for writing, people who copy paintings and pretend as though they're other paintings, or they take the technique of another artist and they paint in that technique and they sell it as though it's the work of that other artist. Forgers, thank you. There are plenty of forgers who may be able to back that up and say, look, all I had to do was just learn these particular skills and I could paint like Raphael paints, and people would think that it's Raphael. But Croce would still say, no, that's not accurate, because what Raphael gives us is not a copy of anything. Raphael isn't copying himself. Raphael is giving us access to some sort of powerful new intuition. and something that we do not innately have access to. And he also talks in this quote about something else I want to mention in just a moment, and about our own experiences. The world which, as a rule, we intuit is a small thing. On a day-to-day basis, we do not intuit or interact with the world as a global thing. We have a small, narrow, limited window into it, a repetitive window into it. Wake up at 8 in the morning, 6 in the morning, get here at 8 in the morning, work, go home, be with family, a regular notion to it that collapses this intuitive and imaginative relationship to the world around us. That's our normal life. That world consists of little expressions, which gradually become greater and wider with the increasing spiritual concentration of certain moments, whatever. They are the words we say to ourselves, our silent judgments. Here is a man. Here is a horse. It is a medley of light and color with no greater pictorial value than would be expressed by a haphazard splash of colors. This and nothing else is what we possess in our ordinary life. This is the basis of our ordinary action, and that's how Raphael slips away from that ordinariness. Even in the day when Raphael was painting, he's slipping away from that ordinariness of the day-to-day. And that becomes another component of this aesthetic expression or aesthetic judgments that we have about them. Now, how does he slip away? Well, first of all, he is crafting a typical icon of the Mother Mary and the baby Jesus, except this is not like any other icon that is crafted. Any of you know anything about medieval Catholic art? You're all professionals in it? No? Well, you may have seen some icons at some point in your lives where you have the mother and the baby seated on her knee. The baby Jesus often has his arm bent and his two fingers up like this. Mary may be looking out at the viewer, maybe looking at Jesus. Very static, and you'll find thousands of examples of this. Raphael and the humanists come along, and now you see a woman, you see a mother. You don't see Mary, not yet. You see a mother, and you see a child, two children. And then if you come closer to the painting, you'll eventually see the skinniest of little halos around her head, signaling, oh my gosh, this is a saint. Oh, I know what's going on here, because here is Jesus holding a crucifix. Even though that's anachronistic, that still fits into this network sort of interpretation here. Something else he has done, not only is this a mother, but this is a literate mother, someone who is reading. Now, anything that we could think about the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East, and the people who lived in the Middle East during this period of the Roman Empire, the class of which Mary was thought to be would not have been a class of literate people. By this point, literacy rates had significantly declined. And so most likely, Mary would not have been literate. But Raphael turns her in expressly. There's no need to have this here. Her hand could just be sitting on her lap, could be doing other things, but no, expressly, a book signaling literacy, an important humanist notion in the Renaissance. All of these craft within the framework of the religious icon, they craft a new relationship to that religious icon, and of course, eventually new relationships to the concepts that are associated with that icon. This is John the Baptist, by the way. The colors, also not typical for an icon, not typical in any way, but those are Raphael's colors. That's astonishing. Do you have any questions about it? I find it hard to move away from the album Madonna, but I'll move on because we have. Does anybody speak Spanish? How do you pronounce Las Meninas? Meninas.
Yeah,
Meninas? Okay.
Nia is when you have the little squiggly line on
Okay,
top.
Las Meninas. There we go, Las Meninas. 1656. Many of you may know this one, Diego Vasquez. This is an important painting for a number of reasons, and I want to just show you a little bit about what's going on here. First of all, there's the painter, there's the canvas, Vasquez is painting on the canvas, looking at us, daughter of the king and queen who are reflected in the mirror as though they are here where we are, and they are the subject of the painting that Vasquez is painting on this canvas. There's other court people here too. And this wonderful someone entering this brightly lighted stairwell in the background is also a focal point for us. There's lots of ways to interpret this, and they're wonderful interpretations of it. I'm going to talk about a couple, but I want to also stress that this young girl here is obviously the subject of the painting. Our eye is drawn to her. She's brighter. She's central. She's the subject. Have you ever tried to get your 6 to 8-year-old to sit still while you took a picture of them? It's very difficult, certainly if they're reactive children. And what I think potentially is one of the little games that's going on here is that Vasquez is painting a portrait of the daughter, and also remarking on that notion of being unable to capture them. She's static, but the other kids have this activity about them. They're pulling her interests away in one direction or another, etc. And so Vasquez, in pretending to paint the parents, and while at the same time also painting them to some extent, is really focused on painting the daughter. But this painting sits at the edge of something that this man, Foucault, talks about, what's called an epistemic, what does he call these things? Not a crisis, but there's a shift, a change that's happening in European culture, a break with what he calls classical representation. And classical representation is I'm the viewer and I'm looking at something that's in the distance, almost like I'm looking through a window. And instead of having that looking through a window, man, I talk a lot, don't I? Instead of looking through the window, I am being looked at while I'm looking at what's going on. And so it creates a different set of relationships. Classical representation is changing at this point. So from Foucault's point of view, the real representation that's going on here, the real thing that we're looking at, is the process of looking at something. We are actually engaged in a relationship with a painting that is making us think about our engagement with the relationships that are in the painting. We become a subject in the painting. We're wrapped into it. And so we are thinking about that fundamental aesthetic concept of perception. It's putting us into the position of thinking about perceiving things. And that could be, certainly, that is a component of it. But there's also more of this slipping away from any purposefulness, because we have a craftsman who's represented here who has a purpose. The craftsman's purpose is to represent the king and the queen, and that's not what the craftsman himself is doing. And so his purpose is being, well, he himself is changing his purpose from craftsman to artist. And, you know, he was obviously a great artist. There's also this fictional set of relationships, the illusion of solidity and consistency, that fourth wall being eroded because we are there in that painting. That is definitely a component of 16th century Spanish thought. The world is an illusion. We are interacting with each other in this illusion. And there's a truth and a real world that's on the other side of the illusion, but we won't have access to that until we die. That is certainly most likely something that Vasquez has in his mind. And I think, too, there's a political statement here in that idea of the real subject being the girl, and that is that that girl is going to grow up and have power over people. And the concept of transition between the family or the king who dies and the transition to the next line is a difficult one, a complicated one, oftentimes causes political strife. And so there seems to be potentially a little bit of a political, almost smoothing over of that potential shift that's inevitable. But back to this particular idea, this representation of representation itself puts us into a moment of art that's going to be, well, really all of modernity. And that is art looking at its own process of production, art looking at its own concepts of representation, how it represents itself. It thinks about itself. Artists think about the process of art. And we see that in the latter part of the 19th century, surely, with the Impressionists and the Cubists and all those other isms that develop. They're thinking not necessarily about representing anything in the real world. They're thinking about representing the concept of art. Beautiful still. I know some of you has anybody seen Persona? Do I have anybody from my film class here? No? Well, if you haven't seen Persona, you should see Persona. It's an astonishing film. Huh?
The Enemy?
The Enemy?
Anime?
The anime? No, goodness, no. They're not animated. It's a film by Ingmar Bergman, 1965. It is a complicated story I cannot sum up. It really is too difficult. But these two women isolated on an island while one of them is recovering from some sort of mental shock. And she is not speaking. The other one does all of the speaking. Alma here does all of the speaking. She, at some point, the two of them find each other together in a bathroom where they are looking into a mirror. So they are looking into a mirror, which is actually us looking back at them. And that's effectively like what's going on with Las Meninas, but whatever that thing is, Las Meninas. Spanish is not one of my languages, sorry. Las Meninas. That's effectively what's going on. That's a reproduction of that sort of set of relationships. Now, it's a fleeting moment. It happens a couple of times in the film. And it's not like the fourth wall breaking and you're overwhelmed by them looking at you and some other things that pop up in film theory. It's not that. It is, you're the mirror. You're reflecting them. You're seeing them see themselves. You're given some sort of little privileged, intimate moment into their lives. And that component, that idea of art giving you some sort of privileged look into an intimacy is derived from the post-Las Meninas movements that happen, certainly the Dutch paintings, which look at the intimate sphere quite extensively. You know a Pietà, right? This is the Pietà, but there are lots of Pietàs. This is the great Pietà. Pietàs are never official. The Catholic Church does not approve of the Pietà for some reason. Catholic Church had, after Michelangelo was dead, they hid this because of a strange sort of, and I'm sure the Da Vinci Code and all of that, doesn't he talk about her as Mary Magdalene instead of Mary the mother, because she's 16 and Jesus is 30-something, so how could this be the mother? At any rate, others are a little bit more complicated. But what I wanted to show you is a certain continuation. So here we have a Pietà, which has a meaning for Michelangelo. Dead, Jesus, a woeful Mary. And of course, she's not very woeful. There's almost a little bit of youthful hope. Her hand is extended, sort of offering up the body of Jesus, etc. And again, if you were in my film class, you would have seen Aguirre, the Wrath of God. Excellent film, which Werner Herzog copies the Pietà. This is the Pietà, except it's flipped. So the father and the daughter, instead of the mother and the son, the father is an insane person who has driven them all to their deaths, and he himself will float away on a raft of monkeys. It's a wonderful ending. She is dying. You can see the blood on his hand. But that same framing of the Pietà, because another aspect of aesthetics is history, and the aesthetic tradition produces imagery, iconic imagery, that becomes a type of language where you can find these various iconic images over and over again in a number of different places. They craft different meanings when they use them. Like I said, this is an inversion of the Pietà, whereas hope is given with the Pietà, the Catholic Pietà. There is nothing hopeful about this. This is the end for them. This is the end for everyone, but if you know the movie, it's not the end for this insane Aguirre who will continue to float towards the ocean on the Amazon River with those monkeys. So art is experience too, and my time is on. There's a specific, there's a real point that I wanted to get to here. I know it doesn't feel like there's a point here, but there was a point, so I may have to flow over this a little bit. But John Dewey suggests that our day-to-day experiences are not necessarily aesthetic, but the aesthetic perception highlights the lack, the sort of emptiness of our normal experiences, thereby giving us some more meaningful engagement with the world around us. And at the same time, and Dewey doesn't think of it this way as being a really real world and a socially real world, but this remark upon the paucity of our own day-to-day experiences also gives us an opening to remembering or thinking about our own social linkages. And this goes all the way back to Kant. Kant is thinking that other reasonable people think the same way I do. The only way I can confirm that is communicating with other reasonable people, thereby creating communal relationships. And that comes through in this too, that your experiences, an aspect of these experiences that get both represented on the screen or represented in art, but that are also represented in you because you have the experience. That aspect is something that reminds you of your linkage to other human beings around you. Community becomes a part of it. And I don't want to undermine or shortchange Mr. Dewey, who was a horrible writer, but an interesting thinker. He was really bad writer. I mean, really tough to read. And not tough in this is deep, I don't understand. I mean, it's like circular. Things undermines himself in places, so read carefully. This is really the place that I wanted to make sure that I got, because on some level, thinking about going to a museum, looking at paintings, is a bit of an abstraction. It is also a bit of it would be nice if we could do that, but we can't. But I was listening to Christopher Wiley's book, and I can't pronounce the name of the book. I guess I can spell it. It's Mind, F asterisk CK. Christopher Wiley was part of Cambridge Analytica, and the book itself is fascinating because it is like listening to or reading someone from 1939 thinking about, man, those counting machines that they have at those camps are fascinating. I bet I could do a lot with those things. And I need to go work in those camps to be able to use those things. There's people doing stuff in the camps. I don't know what's going on over there. I just want to be here with the technology. There's this naivete that he kind of admits to but doesn't really understand, I think. So it's a fascinating in its horribleness, but an interesting read. But what he said that gets me a little anxious is this notion that he has that politics is aesthetics, that politics is an act, that politics is about dressing up in funny costumes or pretty costumes. He has a horrible quote that Cambridge Analytica was in the process of giving information over to people in military units across the world to have other people killed. And for the good, generally speaking, I'm assuming, but that the way he sort of sums it up, he quotes someone else who sums it up by saying, because he came in dressed in a Prada suit, we fight terrorism in Prada. This is this made me anxious because not only does it undermine the concept of aesthetics, which I think is important for us to prevent happening, but it also inverts the relationship. Politics is not aesthetics. Aesthetics can be politics, or maybe aesthetics is politics, but politics is not aesthetic activity. Politics is the way we access truth in a multicultural, complicated society. The only way we get there is through politics. The only way we get there, I'm not talking about politicians, I'm talking about politics. So while the two things are related to each other, art can produce meaning that limits us. Art is a language that fits into political discussions. Art convinces you of things. Art tells you the way to think. Entertainment certainly tells you what to think. But it is not the fact that politics is just simply reducible to being aesthetics. It's much larger than that. There's also a problem of identification, and this comes up in film studies too. When you identify with the human being, a hero, for example, you associate your own personal desires with the desires of that individual. Their desires become mapped onto your desires, almost as though it's convincing you that your own desires, not important. Their desires are what should fill you. We do that all the time in entertainment. When you watch a movie that has a character that you connect with, you have to think, am I connecting with that character because I feel those things, or am I connecting with that character because it's giving me things to feel that resonate somehow with me? That's the demagogue in politics. That's Hitler in politics. That's Mussolini in politics. I am the figure with whom you identify. I take on your pains. I do what's good. You are now filled with my own desires. My desires become your desires. And one of the long-standing problems in film theory about the entertainment concept is that there is no real there's no real vehicle in entertainment in movies that we just simply sit down and enjoy for us to think about those things. Instead, we get overwhelmed by the story, we get overwhelmed by the characters, we get overwhelmed by our own personal demands that the story do something for us, produce a certain feeling for us as a consumer. I've paid this money, you better produce this for me. And that creates this cycle of identification with characters that are not thinkable, but that are emotive somehow. Now, by the same extension, again, I still think I call it the first Batman, but the Batman from, the 90s is the best Batman. I know I'm not necessarily, people are not going to agree with me. The second of those Batmen, I liked a lot when it came out, and now I know is not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination, because I felt as though it meant something to me, and now I see it's not very valuable. If it gets lost in time, that would not hurt anybody's feelings, I don't think. And isn't that the process of rebooting? In comic book movies, every 5 years you get a reboot with a new actor and a new narrative that spins off from it. Because we lose that emotional connection, because the emotional connection of entertainment is not, for someone like Kant would say, it's not a permanent connection. It erodes, it falls apart. The aesthetic connection is something that persists afterwards. We can still sit down and think about and work our way through aesthetic questions. I think that was my last point. So there was a quote that I want to give you because that's missing on here. This aesthetic, and in fact there's a whole slide that's missing. How many of you have ever read, and I know that I'm at the end of my time, but I've got one more thing for you. How many of you have ever read The Confessions by St. Augustine? Were you forced to read it or did you volunteer? Okay, yeah. So there's this wonderful quote in St. Augustine. St. Augustine is dealing with this group of people called the Manichaeans, and I don't want to get into the detail of that. But he listens to a sermon by a man by the name of Jerome, the Catholics call St. Jerome. And he says, "For although I did not trouble to take what Ambrose said to heart, but only to listen to the manner in which he said it, this being the only paltry interest that remained to me, now that I had lost all hope that man could find the path that led to you. Nevertheless, his meaning, which I tried to ignore, found its way into my mind together with his words, which I admired so much. I could not keep the two apart. And while I was all ears to seize upon his eloquence, I also began to sense the truth of what he said, though only gradually." The reason why I use that quote, I know I have to explain myself, is that what this shows is that not only that there is a linkage between politics, which is not just the access to truth and modernity, but it's also a process of persuasion. We have to admit to that. There's a linkage, there's an aesthetic linkage to that, in the eloquence of speeches, in the eloquence of someone's voice, the tone, the way they present themselves. That is also an aesthetic. We perceive that, we feel that, but it also connects us to something that we think of as being truthful. So I think that the reason why I link politics, especially in truth and aesthetics, is that these three things are supporting each other. That there is an aesthetic quality to being engaged in a political campaign, for example. And that can produce positive outcomes. It can produce, obviously, strongly negative outcomes. So it's not as though there is a good that is being achieved. It's simply a striving for that aesthetic pleasure, I guess we could say. And so that means that this notion of politics and aesthetics linked together is one that you should continue to think about. I know that this is the last lecture you will ever hear. It's not really. And you may forget about much of this when you go out, and that would be fine too. But that this should hang around with you, right? That this notion, there's a relationship between aesthetics. There's certainly a relationship between entertainment and politics. And that there's that relationship is something that we should be strongly concerned with, we should think about, and affect somehow in the future as we move on, as you move on into your lives. This is my last lecture, so I'm dying after this. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. I appreciate it.